If you came here to die, little one, you chose the wrong door. Grace Miller barely recognized her own voice as she stared down at the tiny wolf pup lying on the snow outside her cottage. Only seconds earlier, 3 heavy knocks had pulled her from sleep. She had expected a fallen branch or some desperate traveler lost in the storm. Instead, standing 20 feet beyond her porch was the largest white wolf she had ever seen. Grace knew him immediately. Everyone in Silverpine did. The enormous creature belonged to Alpha King Nathan Cole, though saying he belonged to anyone had always seemed foolish. The royal beast obeyed the king when he wished and ignored everyone else completely. Under the moonlight, his white coat almost disappeared against the snow, leaving only 2 pale blue eyes fixed on Grace. She should have closed the door. Every warning she had heard since childhood told her exactly that. Yet the beast had not come closer. He had placed the pup at her doorstep and stepped backward. Grace looked down again. The pup was small enough to fit against her chest, its silver-gray fur damp with melted snow, its breathing so faint she had to kneel to see the gentle rise beneath its ribs. "You brought him to me?" she whispered. The white beast lowered his head once. Grace's heartbeat stumbled. That could not have been an answer. Wolves did not seek her out. People barely did. At 24, Grace lived alone nearly 3 miles beyond Silverpine's last occupied farmhouse, where the forest swallowed the road and winter arrived earlier than anywhere else in the valley. The pack called her incomplete because she had never managed a full shift. Some called her useless when they thought she could not hear. Grace had stopped correcting them years ago. Animals were different. Their fear never felt cruel. Their pain came to her as quietly as weather changing, an ache beneath her own ribs that told her when something needed help. She reached toward the pup. The instant her fingertips touched its fur, cold exhaustion rushed through her so strongly that she nearly pulled away. "Oh, sweetheart." The pup gave a tiny breath. Grace looked toward the royal beast. His posture had changed. The legendary animal everyone feared looked almost anxious. "I can try," she told him. "That is all I can promise." His ears lifted. Grace slipped both hands beneath the pup and carried it inside. It weighed hardly more than 8 pounds. She wrapped it in the thick wool blanket from her couch and moved it near the fireplace, careful not to warm it too quickly. A shallow bowl of water waited nearby. Grace checked its breathing again, then placed her palm lightly over its side. Weak, but there. Outside, snow tapped softly against the windows. Grace glanced toward the door, expecting the white beast to have disappeared into the forest. He had not. Through the frosted glass, she could see his pale shape stretched across the porch, facing outward toward the darkness as though guarding the cottage. "You are waiting," Grace murmured. An hour passed, then 2. The pup's breathing became steadier, and Grace finally allowed herself a small smile. "That is better." Suddenly, warmth moved beneath her palm. Not from the fireplace, from somewhere inside her. Grace froze. A faint silver glow appeared between her fingers, illuminating a tiny crescent hidden beneath the pup's fur. Her breath caught. Outside, the white beast rose instantly and turned toward the door. Grace stared at the glowing mark. She had seen that crescent only once before, embroidered above the throne inside Silverpine's royal hall. "What are you?" she whispered. The pup opened its eyes. The pup's eyes were pale blue, almost the same impossible color as the royal beast waiting outside. Grace forgot to breathe for a moment. The little animal did not move beyond that fragile opening of its eyes, but something had changed. The weakness pressing against Grace's senses no longer felt like a fading candle. It felt like a flame struggling to rise. "Stay with me," she whispered. She adjusted the wool blanket around the pup and placed another piece of firewood into the hearth. The cottage warmed gradually while snow continued gathering against the windows. Grace kept one hand near the pup without touching it, afraid the strange silver light might return. She had spent years hiding the small things she could do, the way frightened animals calmed near her, the way she sometimes knew where something hurt before anyone else did. Those abilities had been easy to dismiss as instinct. Glowing hands were different. Outside, the white beast remained on the porch. Grace could hear his weight shifting occasionally against the wooden boards. He had every reason to return to Blackwood Keep, nearly 6 miles north through the forest, yet he stayed. Grace finally approached the door and opened it several inches. Cold air slipped inside. "He is breathing better," she told him. The beast looked past her toward the fireplace. You understand me, do you not? His ears moved forward. Grace almost smiled. That makes one of us. She closed the door and returned to the pup. Near 2 in the morning, its breathing suddenly became shallow again. Grace's stomach tightened. She placed her palm against its side, and the sensation hit her immediately. Cold. Fear. A strange heaviness that did not belong there. No, no. You were getting stronger. The crescent beneath its fur flickered faintly. Grace remembered the silver warmth that had moved through her hand earlier. She did not understand it, but understanding could wait. The pup could not. She gathered the tiny animal carefully against her chest, wrapping the blanket around both of them. You are not alone, she whispered. Whatever is happening, you are not doing it alone. For several minutes, nothing changed. Then warmth stirred beneath Grace's ribs. It traveled down her arms and into her palms, gentle rather than frightening. Silver light appeared again, brighter this time. The crescent on the pup answered with a soft glow of its own. Grace closed her eyes. Beneath the weakness, she sensed something she had missed before, almost like a thread tied around the pup's natural strength, keeping it from fully returning. She did not pull at it. She simply imagined warmth surrounding that thread until its pressure loosened. The pup inhaled deeply. Grace opened her eyes. Another breath followed, stronger. Then another. A tiny paw shifted against the blanket. Relief rushed through her so quickly that she laughed under her breath. There you are. Outside, the royal beast rose. Instead of looking toward Grace, he turned toward the forest. For several seconds, he stood perfectly still, listening to something beyond human hearing. Then he looked back through the window at her. Grace sensed urgency in him now, but not fear for the pup beside her. Something else was waiting in the woods. The beast stepped off the porch. Wait. Grace hurried to the door, but he was already moving through the snow. He stopped once at the tree line and looked back. His pale eyes met hers as if asking her to trust him. Then he disappeared among the pines. Grace stood in the doorway until the cold forced her inside. By 4 in the morning, the pup was sleeping peacefully. Grace settled beside the fireplace, too exhausted to wonder where the white beast had gone. She must have slept for less than an hour when a soft scratching sound came from the front door. Grace opened her eyes. The sky beyond the windows had begun turning gray. Another scratch followed. Then a tiny whine. Grace slowly stood and reached for the door. Something told her the royal beast had returned. She was wrong. When Grace opened it, 3 small pairs of pale blue eyes were waiting in the snow. Grace stared at the 3 pups gathered on her porch. Certain exhaustion had finally turned the morning into a dream. They were larger than the pups sleeping beside her fireplace, but not by much. Each with thick silver gray fur dusted in snow and the same pale blue eyes. None appeared frightened. They simply sat there, shoulder to shoulder, watching her as though they had been told exactly where to wait. Where did you come from? Grace whispered. The smallest pup tilted its head. Grace glanced toward the tree line. The white beast was nowhere in sight. Dawn had begun coloring the eastern sky, turning the snow beneath the pines faintly blue. She stepped onto the porch and immediately felt something unusual. Not the crushing weakness she had sensed from the first pup, but 3 separate currents of unease, each carrying the same strange heaviness. Grace crouched. He brought you 2, did he not? One pup walked forward and pressed its nose against her fingers. Warmth moved through her hand. Beneath the fur near its chest, a crescent shimmered. Grace's stomach tightened. She checked the second pup. Another crescent. Then the third. The same mark. 4, she murmured. For pups, carrying a symbol reserved for the royal house. This was no accident. Grace brought them inside one at a time, dried their coats with old towels, and arranged blankets near the hearth. The first pup awakened when the others entered. Its tail moved weakly against the blanket. The 3 newcomers immediately gathered around it, touching noses and settling close. Grace watched them with a tenderness that quickly gave way to concern. They knew each other. More importantly, they had all been affected by the same mysterious weakness. She placed her hand near the largest pup and closed her eyes. The sensation returned immediately, like an invisible weight pressing against something naturally bright. Someone did something to you, she whispered. The silver warmth stirred beneath her palms, but Grace pulled back. Healing one exhausted pup had nearly drained her. Trying to help all 4 without understanding her gift could make things worse. A distant sound carried through the forest. Horses. Grace stood and looked through the window. Several riders appeared between the snow-covered trees, moving quickly along the narrow road toward her cottage. At their front rode a tall man in a black winter coat, his posture unmistakably commanding even from a distance. Grace recognized him before she could see his face. Alpha King Nathan Cole. Her pulse jumped. The riders stopped near the fence. Nathan dismounted first, his pale gray eyes moving from the tracks in the snow to Grace's open doorway. Grace Miller. His voice was calm, but urgency lived beneath it. Yes. Where is my wolf? Grace hesitated. He left before dawn. Nathan's expression sharpened. He came here. He brought me something. A tiny sound came from inside the cottage. Nathan went still. Grace stepped aside. His gaze passed her and landed on the 4 pups gathered beside the fire. Every trace of royal composure disappeared from his face. That is impossible. Grace looked at him. You know them? Nathan entered only after she nodded permission. He crouched several feet from the pups, staring at their crescent marks. They vanished from the royal sanctuary 3 nights ago. Grace's breath caught. All 4. All 4. Nathan looked toward the snowy forest, confusion darkening his expression. We searched every mile between the sanctuary and the northern ridge. Grace folded her arms against the cold entering through the doorway. Then your beast found them. Nathan slowly shook his head. No. He turned toward her. Orion disappeared the same night they did. Before Grace could answer, a deep, familiar sound came from the porch. Everyone turned. The enormous white beast stood outside, snow covering his back. He did not look at Nathan. He looked only at Grace. Then Orion lowered his head before her. Orion remained perfectly still with his great white head lowered toward Grace, and the silence inside the cottage became so complete that she could hear the fire settling behind her. Nathan stared at his royal beast, as though he had forgotten the 4 missing pups entirely. Orion, he said. The wolf lifted his eyes, but did not move. Nathan took one careful step closer. Come. Orion stayed beside Grace. One of the royal guards shifted uneasily near the porch, but Nathan raised a hand, signaling everyone to remain where they were. Grace looked from the Alpha King to the enormous animal. Has he done this before? Nathan's gaze remained fixed on Orion. He has never bowed to anyone. Grace almost laughed from nerves. Maybe he is tired. He crossed at least 6 miles through a snowstorm, found 4 missing royal pups, and brought them to an Omega he has never met. Nathan finally looked at her. I do not think he is tired. Grace felt every old judgment hidden inside that sentence, even though Nathan had not spoken it cruelly. An Omega who could not fully shift. A woman living beyond the edge of the pack. Someone the royal beast should have passed without noticing. She folded her arms. Then asked him why he came. Something almost amused flickered across Nathan's face. If Orion answered questions, my life would be considerably easier. Behind them, the weakest pup made a soft sound. Grace turned immediately. Its breathing had become shallow again. The other 3 pups rose and crowded close, restless now. Grace forgot about Nathan. She knelt beside the blankets and placed her hand near the smallest pup. The familiar heaviness returned, stronger than before. This time, however, she sensed the same pressure inside all 4 animals, like 4 knots tied along a single invisible thread. They are connected, she whispered. Nathan crouched several feet away. What do you mean? Whatever is making them weak is the same thing. Grace closed her eyes. The silver warmth beneath her ribs awakened almost instantly. She tried to resist it, remembering how exhausted she had felt hours earlier, but the smallest pup shivered beneath her palm. Grace. Nathan's voice softened. What are you doing? I wish I knew. Light appeared between her fingers. The guards outside fell silent. Nathan stared at the silver glow as it spread gently across the pup's crescent mark. Then something unexpected happened. The other 3 crescents illuminated at the same time. 4 points of silver light filled the small cottage. Grace inhaled sharply as warmth rushed through both hands. She could feel 4 heartbeats now, separate yet strangely synchronized. Orion entered the cottage without waiting for permission and lay beside her, his white body forming a protective barrier between Grace and everyone else. Nathan's expression shifted from disbelief to recognition. I have seen that light before. Grace opened her eyes. Where? Nathan did not answer immediately. He looked at Orion, then at the glowing marks, then back at Grace. When I was 7, my mother became dangerously ill. A woman came to the palace and placed her hands over my mother's heart. Silver light filled the room exactly like this. Grace's concentration nearly broke. Who was she? The last recorded moon healer in Silverpine. The words settled over Grace like falling snow. That is impossible. Nathan's eyes dropped to the small crescent now glowing faintly beneath Grace's wrist, a mark she had carried since childhood and always mistaken for an ordinary birthmark. His face went still. Grace followed his gaze. For the first time in her life, her own crescent was shining. Orion lowered his head beside her, and Nathan whispered, "Apparently, it is not impossible at all." Grace stared at the glowing crescent beneath her wrist until the silver light began to fade. She had seen that mark every day since childhood, a pale curve no larger than a dime, and never once imagined it meant anything. Her mother had called it a family birthmark, nothing more. Now Orion rested beside her as if guarding something sacred, for royal Pups watched her with pale blue eyes, and the Alpha King was looking at her as though an old story had suddenly stepped into his morning. Moon healers disappeared generations ago, Grace said. Nathan shook his head. The bloodline disappeared from royal records. That is not necessarily the same thing. Grace looked down at the weakest pup. Its breathing was steadier again, but the strange pressure remained beneath her senses. Then why would someone hide them? Nathan's expression darkened. That is a question I intend to answer. One of the guards appeared at the doorway. Your Majesty, the royal physician is less than 20 minutes away. Nathan nodded. Tell her to come alone. No counsel. Grace noticed the distinction. Why no counsel? Nathan glanced toward the pups. Because 4 royal animals vanished from a protected sanctuary. Orion disappeared with them, and somehow he knew exactly where to bring the sickest one. His eyes settled on Grace. Until I know why, I am not assuming everyone inside the palace deserves the truth. Grace had spent years believing kings lived without uncertainty. Nathan carried his quietly, but she could see it now. He was afraid for the pups. She returned her attention to them and placed both palms near the blankets. I think whatever is affecting them is weakening. Can you remove it? I do not know. Nathan crouched opposite her. Then do not risk yourself proving that you can. Grace looked up, surprised. Most people in Silverpine had spent years demanding proof that she was useful. Nathan was the first person to tell her she did not owe it. Before she could answer, Orion rose and walked toward the cottage wall beside the fireplace. He scratched once at the floorboards. Grace frowned. What is it? Orion scratched again. Nathan stood. Grace moved a small wooden chest aside and found an old loose plank beneath it. Her mother had forbidden her from lifting that board when Grace was a child. She had forgotten about it completely. Grace pulled it upward. Beneath the floor was a narrow compartment containing a weathered leather box. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside lay a silver pendant shaped like a crescent moon and a folded letter bearing her mother's handwriting. Grace unfolded it carefully. The message was short. If the royal white guardian ever finds you, do not run from him. He remembers what the kingdom chose to forget. Grace read the sentence twice. Nathan's face became unreadable. Royal white guardian? She whispered. His gaze shifted toward Orion. That is what my family called his bloodline before the moon healers vanished. Grace looked at the great white wolf. You knew my mother? Orion stepped forward and touched his nose gently to the silver pendant. The 4 pups immediately lifted their heads. Their crescents brightened together. Grace felt the invisible thread connecting them pull toward the pendant, then toward her. A second line of writing slowly appeared across the letter in silver light. Nathan leaned closer, but did not touch it. Grace read the words aloud. When 4 moons return to the guardian, the healer must choose whether the old bond lives again. Silence filled the cottage. Nathan looked at the 4 pups. 4 moons. Grace followed his gaze. The smallest pup rose unsteadily, crossed the blanket, and placed one paw against her knee. Then the other 3 did the same. Orion lowered his head. Nathan's voice was barely a whisper. He did not bring them here because they were lost. Grace felt the truth before he finished. He brought them here to find me. Grace looked at Orion differently after that. Until now, she had seen an extraordinary animal acting on instincts she could not understand. But the letter suggested something older, something deliberate. The great white wolf had not wandered through 6 miles of winter forest by chance. He had followed a promise made before Grace was old enough to remember it. Why me? She whispered. Orion only watched her. Nathan picked up the leather box and examined its faded crest without disturbing anything inside. This belonged to the Royal Healing Order. Grace turned toward him. You recognize it? From the archives. The order served my family before my grandfather was born, but most records about them were removed decades ago. Grace felt anger beneath her confusion. Removed by whom? I do not know yet. Hoofbeats approached outside before Nathan could say more. A woman in a dark blue winter cloak entered moments later carrying a physician's bag. Dr. Helen Ward was nearly 60, with silver hair and the composed expression of someone accustomed to royal emergencies. Her composure disappeared when she saw Grace's pendant. Where did you get that? My mother left it for me. Helen slowly set down her bag. What was her name? Margaret Miller. The physician closed her eyes briefly. Margaret Vale before she married. Grace stared at her. Her mother had never used that name. Nathan's attention sharpened. Vale. Helen nodded. She was descended from the last recognized moon healer family. Grace looked toward the letter in disbelief. Why would she hide that? Because after the healing order was dissolved, families carrying the gift stopped registering their children. Helen's voice softened. Your mother wanted you to grow up unnoticed. Grace almost laughed at the bitter irony. She had certainly been unnoticed. Nathan glanced toward the 4 pups. Examine them. Helen knelt near the blankets, careful not to touch until the pups accepted her presence. After several minutes, she frowned. They are not sick in any ordinary sense. Grace's chest tightened. Then what is happening? Their natural energy is being suppressed. Helen looked toward the glowing crescents. Something connected to old royal magic. Grace remembered the invisible knots she had sensed. Can it be reversed? Helen looked at her hands. Perhaps not by me. Nathan immediately shook his head. We are not asking Grace to attempt something dangerous. Helen studied him, mildly surprised by the force in his voice. Nor should we. Moon healing was never supposed to work through force. She turned to Grace. It responds to willing bonds. The smallest pup stood and crossed the blanket toward Grace. One by one, the others followed. They settled around her knees. Orion lay behind them, calm and watchful. Grace felt 4 quiet pulses reaching toward her. Not demanding, asking. She closed her eyes and let her hands rest loosely in her lap. All right, she whispered. I will listen. Warmth gathered beneath her palms. Silver light filled the room, but this time Grace did not push it toward the pups. She allowed the 4 heartbeats to guide her. The invisible knots appeared inside her awareness, and suddenly she understood. They were not 4 separate bindings. They were pieces of one seal. Grace opened her eyes. Someone used them together. Helen went pale. Nathan leaned closer. For what? Grace looked toward Orion. The white beast was staring at the northern window, toward the distant royal sanctuary. Through their strange connection, Grace sensed a single image, a stone chamber beneath Blackwood Keep and a crescent carved into its door. The pups were never the target, she whispered. Nathan's expression hardened. Then what was? Grace touched the pendant at her throat as it began glowing with the same silver light. Whatever is locked beneath your palace. Nathan's gaze shifted toward the northern window, where Blackwood Keep stood somewhere beyond 6 miles of snow-covered forest. There is no chamber beneath the palace, he said. Helen's expression told Grace otherwise. Nathan noticed. Doctor. Helen slowly removed her gloves. There are sealed rooms beneath the oldest wing, Your Majesty. Most were closed before you were born. Nathan's jaw tightened. And no one thought the king should know? Your father ordered the records restricted. Grace touched the silver pendant at her throat. Its warmth had not faded. Orion rose and walked toward the door, then looked back at them. I think he wants us to follow, Grace said. Nathan immediately turned to the guards. Prepare the horses. Grace shook her head. The pups cannot travel through this cold. Then they stay here with Helen. Orion gave a low sound. All 4 pups stood at once. Helen stared at them. Apparently, that is not their preference. Nathan looked at Grace. Then we moved carefully. Less than 20 minutes later, Grace sat inside a covered royal carriage with the pups bundled beside her while Orion traveled alongside through the snow. Nathan rode ahead until the dark stone towers of Blackwood Keep appeared through the pines. Grace had visited the palace only twice in her life, both times standing among hundreds of pack members who barely noticed her. Entering now with the Alpha King beside her felt unreal. Servants stopped as Orion led them past the grand staircase and toward a narrow corridor behind the old library. Nathan dismissed everyone except Helen and 2 trusted guards. At the corridor's end stood a stone wall. Orion pressed his nose against one carved block. A hidden seam appeared. Nathan pushed against it, revealing a staircase descending into darkness. "My father knew about this," he murmured. Grace held the smallest pup, while the other 3 followed close behind. The stairs ended nearly 30 feet below the palace at a circular chamber sealed by a silver door. A crescent was carved at its center. Grace's pendant began glowing. So did the pups. Nathan stepped toward the door, but Orion moved between them. "He does not want you touching it," Grace said. Nathan looked at her. "Why?" She closed her eyes and listened to the strange current running through the room. The answer came as sensation rather than words. "Because it was never meant to open for an alpha." Helen inhaled sharply. "Of course." Nathan turned. "What?" The old bond between the crown and moon healers was based on balance. The king protected the healer, but only the healer could open the sanctuary. Grace looked at the door. "Sanctuary." Helen nodded. "If the stories are accurate, this was where royal wolves came when ordinary medicine could not help them." Grace stepped closer, for crescents brightened behind her. The silver door opened without her touching it. Beyond was not treasure or a weapon, but a quiet chamber filled with shelves of sealed journals, healing instruments, and portraits covered by white cloth. Grace entered slowly. Her attention went immediately to one portrait near the center. She removed the cloth. A young woman with Grace's eyes stared back at her, wearing the same crescent pendant. Beneath the portrait were 3 words: Margaret Vale, Moon Healer. "My mother," Grace whispered. Nathan stood beside her, stunned. Helen opened a nearby journal and quickly scanned the final pages. "Grace, you need to see this." The last entry was dated 24 years earlier. Margaret had written that the moon healers were not disappearing. They were being erased from royal history because someone feared the bond they protected. Nathan's face hardened. "Who?" Grace turned the page. One name had been written beneath the final warning. Nathan read it aloud. "Counselor Richard Vale." Grace went cold. "Vale?" Helen looked at her. "Your mother's older brother." Before anyone could speak again, footsteps echoed from the staircase above. Orion turned toward the door. Grace felt the 4 pups crowd against her legs. A man's calm voice drifted down through the darkness. "You were never supposed to find this room." The voice stopped everyone except Orion. The white beast stepped forward and positioned himself between Grace and the staircase, his posture alert but controlled. Nathan moved beside him. "Richard," he called into the darkness. A tall older man appeared at the bottom of the stairs wearing a charcoal overcoat dusted with snow. Grace recognized Counselor Richard Vale immediately. She had seen him at ceremonies since childhood without ever knowing he was her uncle. His eyes found the portrait of Margaret, then settled on Grace. Something like regret crossed his face. "You look like her." Grace tightened her fingers around the pendant. "You knew who I was. From the day you were born." Nathan's voice became cold. "Explain why Margaret's journal says you erased the moon healers from royal history." Richard looked toward the 4 pups clustered around Grace. "Because the old bond gave healers influence over royal wolves that no council could control." "Influence?" Helen said. "They healed them." Richard shook his head. They could sense what royal wolves sensed. "Secrets. Intentions. Fear. My father believed no family should hold that kind of access to the crown." Grace stared at him. "So you punished an entire bloodline for being trusted?" Richard's expression tightened. "I continued what had already begun. Records disappeared. Families were encouraged to leave. Your mother refused." Grace looked toward Margaret's portrait. "That is why she hid me." Richard did not answer, and his silence was enough. Nathan stepped closer. "What happened to the pups?" Richard's confidence finally weakened. "The seal beneath this sanctuary was failing. I tried to reinforce it using the 4 royal crescents." Helen stared at him. "You used their energy as anchors." "I believed it would protect the chamber." Grace felt the invisible knots again and suddenly understood why the pups had weakened together. But the sanctuary did not want to remain sealed. Richard looked at her. It was meant to stay forgotten. Orion turned his head toward Grace. She felt no anger from him, only patience. The same patience he had shown outside her cottage while she saved the first pup. Grace knelt among the 4 small wolves. "You brought them to me because I could release the seal." Orion lowered his head. Grace placed her hands near the pups. I will not force anything. One by one, they touched their noses to her fingers. Silver light flowed through the chamber. The pressure Grace had sensed inside them began loosening, not breaking violently, but unraveling like knots finally allowed to open. The pups' crescents brightened. The smallest pup gave a happy little sound and stood taller. Then all four bounded toward Orion with new energy. Grace laughed through sudden tears. Helen checked them and smiled. Their strength is returning. At the same moment, every covered portrait in the chamber began glowing. The white cloth slipped gently to the floor, revealing generations of men and women wearing crescent pendants. Names appeared across the silver walls, hundreds of them, preserved beneath the false history written above. Nathan looked around in stunned silence. The sanctuary kept its own record. Grace understood then. The truth had never been destroyed. It had only been waiting for someone willing to open the door. Richard lowered his gaze. Nathan addressed the guards. Counselor Vale will remain under royal supervision while every record is examined and every affected family is found. Richard offered no resistance. As the guards escorted him upstairs, Grace remained beside her mother's portrait. She spent her life hiding me. Nathan came to stand several feet away. She spent her life keeping you safe. Grace looked at him. Those are not always the same thing. Nathan nodded. No, they are not. He did not try to soften the truth. Somehow, Grace appreciated that. Behind them, Orion approached and lowered his head once more. This time Nathan smiled faintly. I think he has made his opinion of you very clear. Grace touched Orion's white fur. Her crescent glowed, and the sanctuary answered with warm silver light. Then Nathan's expression changed. Beneath his collar, a mark over his heart had begun glowing too. Nathan looked down at the silver light beneath his collar as though he had never seen his own skin before. Grace felt the sanctuary respond at the same instant, a quiet pulse moving through the floor beneath their feet. The four pups stopped playing and turned toward him. Orion remained beside Grace, calm and watchful. What is that mark? She asked. Nathan slowly opened the top of his coat enough to reveal a pale crescent over his heart. I have had it since birth. Every Blackwood heir carries one, but mine has never done this. Helen stepped closer, astonishment softening her features. Because the royal mark was only half of the old bond. Grace looked at the crescent beneath her wrist. And mine is the other half. Not exactly, Helen said. The old records never described ownership or obligation. The bond required recognition from both sides. A king could not command a moon healer to accept it. Nathan's gaze immediately found Grace. Then nothing changes unless you want it to. Those words mattered more than Grace expected. All her life, other people had decided what her limitations meant. Too weak to serve. Too incomplete to matter. Too strange to belong. Now the most powerful man in Silverpine stood before her with ancient magic glowing over his heart, and he was giving her something no prophecy could replace. Choice. Grace looked around the sanctuary at generations of forgotten healers. I want their names restored. Nathan nodded. They will be. I want every family pushed away because of this gift invited home, if they choose to return. Done. Grace held his gaze. And no Omega in Silverpine is ever going to be called useless because they cannot shift the way everyone expects. Something changed in Nathan's expression. Respect, perhaps, but deeper than that. Then we changed the law. Helen smiled quietly. Grace glanced toward her mother's portrait. For years, she had believed Margaret left her nothing except questions. Now Grace understood that her mother had left her a door, trusting that one day she would be strong enough to decide whether to open it. Orion walked between Grace and Nathan and touched his nose to Nathan's hand, then Grace's. Silver light moved between their marks. Grace felt a presence stir somewhere deep inside herself. She froze. It was warm, gentle, and unmistakably alive. Grace? Nathan asked. She pressed a hand over her heart. There is something there. Helen's eyes widened. Your wolf. Grace shook her head. I never had one. Perhaps she was never absent, Helen said softly. Perhaps she was waiting until you stopped measuring yourself by everyone else's strength. Grace closed her eyes. For the first time, the quiet inside her answered back. Not with a roar. With a steady heartbeat. Tears warmed her eyes as she smiled. When she opened them, Nathan had not moved closer. He was waiting. Grace appreciated that too. What happens now? She asked. Nathan extended his hand, but stopped several inches from hers. You decide. Grace looked at his hand, then at Orion and the 4 healthy pups gathered beneath the restored portraits. Less than one night ago, she had been an overlooked Omega living alone beyond the edge of the pack. Now an erased history had returned because a white wolf trusted her with one dying pup. Grace placed her hand in Nathan's. Their crescents glowed together, warm rather than blinding. Deep within Nathan, his wolf recognized the presence answering inside Grace, and one word passed quietly between them. Mate. Grace looked at Nathan. That does not mean you get to order me around. A surprised laugh escaped him. I suspected that might be your first royal decree. She smiled. Good. Hours later, when Grace walked out of Blackwood Keep, morning sunlight covered the valley. Orion moved beside her, the 4 pups bounding happily through fresh snow while Nathan walked at her other side, neither ahead of her nor behind. For the first time, Grace did not feel incomplete. She had never needed the kingdom to make her whole. The kingdom had simply needed to learn how to see her.